All right, welcome back, everybody. Going to get into the lecture for Unit 11. Um, my personal favorite unit, the one that I'm most excited for, which is, of course, the Mongols, the baddest of the badasses of the post-classical era. Um, so this unit is going to look a little bit at just pastoralism in general, its place in history, where pastoral societies generally occupy in the grand scheme of things, and how the Mongols basically completely overturn the apple cart. The Mongols do things historically that nobody had done up to that point, and in a lot of cases, nobody has repeated up until this point in history. And they occupied a place and a time within world history that, for the most part, pastoral people shouldn't have been able to occupy. Pastoral people generally throughout history are on the fringes. They, harass and raid the larger, more advanced agrarian civilizations, but very rarely do you see pastoral peoples make the kind of impact that the Mongols do, and this is kind of the reason for the title of the unit. If you've been watching the crash courses, you know that John Green, like myself, loves the Mongols. They are an anachronism. They are the exception to all of the standard rules of world history, right? So, as far as the recommended supplemental viewing goes, obviously, Crash Course 17, the one on the Mongols, you need to watch it. Crash Course 20 would also be very helpful, partially for this unit and partially for going forward when we get to the post Mongol world and we get to the gunpowder empires. When we start talking about the building of a Russian empire, of which the Mongols had a lot to do with. The BBC documentary on Genghis Khan is literally really only about Genghis Khan. It's not really about the Mongols. It doesn't really fit into kind of our big picture look at this unit. But it does give you a lot of really good, interesting detail about his life personally, early years, his rise to supremacy, his early campaigns against China, his early campaigns against Khwarezm in Central Asia. And then the other one that I recommended was the TED Talk. This is a series that TED Talk does. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with TED Talk, but it's a really interesting resource. I would check it out if you're not familiar with it. But essentially, they do this series where they put famous, or in this case, infamous, historical characters on trial and see if the narrative about them really holds up. This would be really, really helpful for the DBQ project that we're working on during this unit, because it really is going to kind of show both sides to Khan and the Mongols. Now, before we get to the Mongols specifically, I want to talk about where pastoral people fit into this big picture of world history. Because, like I said on the last slide, generally pastoral peoples are on the fringes of, what we look at as kind of the civilized world. They occupy certain niches, however you want to pronounce it, but generally they are not the big movers and shakers of history, right? Um, so, in terms of the traits of these pastoral groups, things that are kind of across the board true of pastoral people, generally they live in regions where agriculture is difficult, you know, for obvious reasons. If agriculture is difficult, it's going to be extremely hard to set up an agrarian settled society. So these people tend to turn to the domestication of animals. um, they raise and they herd livestock. The animals are there essentially lifeline. They use every part of the animals. They use them to hunt. They use them for transportation. They use them for food, for hides, for skin, for clothing. In some cases, housing. They use them for their milk and their, dairy products. Essentially, they depend on the animals nearly as much as the animals depend on them. And because of this, pastoral people are generally almost always nomadic. Their herds have to move regularly, so they must be mobile. Now, one of the side effects of this is that a lot of the very early innovations in transportation and travel come out of pastoral peoples. Generally, even though they're not, like I said, the movers and shakers, they do contribute quite a bit technologically in certain eras. The horse is first domesticated by pastoral peoples in Central Asia. Stirrups are developed by Central Asian nomads, Turks. The chariot is developed by a semi nomadic people known as the Hittites from northern Turkey, southern Russia. The camel saddle is invented by a nomadic people, the Arabs. So, because of their need to be mobile, because of their need to be constantly on the move and to keep their herds fed, they contribute quite a bit to our advancement in terms of our travel and trade and communication. Generally, these groups tend to be spread over pretty large areas, mainly for two reasons. Number one is, herding requires a lot of land. Pastoral animals eat pretty constantly. So, not only must they move in order to maintain a food supply, but they've got to have access to quite a bit of land as well. Another reason why these groups tend to be very spread out over large areas is, again, because of the areas that they inhabit. Um, Generally, these are flat, low-lying areas with some grasses, but not very rich soil. What you tend to see is agricultural societies tend to cluster in areas where agriculture is going to be most beneficial. Like we talked about with those early civilizations, they cluster around rivers, they cluster around the coastline, they cluster around, valleys, places where there's regular rainfall. Well, that leaves a lot of open land. And so pastoral peoples generally have larger tracts of land available to them because they're willing to occupy land that is not suitable for agriculture, and therefore that land is not really in high demand. Now, another side effect of being spread over large areas is that most pastoral peoples lack real highly defined, organized political structure. With no like large central cities, with no large centralized populations, it's hard to build a strong state with an organized bureaucracy, with functioning infrastructure, because there's no tax base. All of those things require money. And if you don't have a large, a big centralized population, there's not many people to tax. This is why a lot of pastoral groups get involved in trade as well, so that they can, build some sort of revenue stream. So in these pastoral groups, what you tend to see is that power and authority and culture are all united under the idea of kinship, okay? Where authority and those in power, those political groups form through family relations, usually through extended families, several generations living and working in the same area to survive. Generally, these are known as clans or they're known as tribes. Um, Another trait of pastoral people is that because they live in areas where agriculture is difficult, life is generally difficult as well. So these people develop a much more kind of Spartan lifestyle, and everyone is required to contribute, kind of like what I call, all hands on deck. Because of this, socially, they tend to be more egalitarian than agricultural societies. Agriculture allows for specialization of labor. Specialization of labor leads to social stratification. Well, if you have less specialized labor, you're going to have less social stratification. So there's a smaller divide between rich and poor. There's a smaller divide between men and women. Women are expected to contribute. They're expected to work. They're expected to fight, generally on the same level as men. So they have more equality, generally a higher status in pastoral societies as well. Now, that's not to say that pastoral people have no interaction with their settled neighbors. In fact, they depend on the interaction with their settled neighbors for numerous things, mainly food. Agricultural societies produce a lot of it. Pastoral peoples do not produce a lot of it. So when times get rough, generally you'll see that the relationship between pastoral people and their farming neighbors tends to improve because one side or the other needs the other one. They also rely on agricultural societies for technology, for luxury items that they can't produce themselves, again, because there is very little specialization of labor among pastoral peoples. And generally, this is acquired through trade for the most part, which is why pastoral peoples, especially in Central Asia, play such a massive role in the building and the functioning of the Silk Road, but also sometimes through military raids. We've talked about this in the past with the Chinese tribute system and the Xiongnu. We've talked about this in the past with the Gazu raids by the Arab peoples. And the last thing that's generally true about pastoral peoples is because of the lack of specialized labor, they usually have little or no written language. So generally, their history is written by other civilizations, which is why you tend to see pastoral groups portrayed historically as barbaric, as uncivilized, as, like you said, on the fringes of society.